My daughter left the phone off the hook. I heard the laugh that used to lull her to sleep, then a man's voice, calm and clinical, saying, "He's becoming a burden. We should place him." The fork slipped from my hand and hit the floor. I'd sanded myself. The house felt suddenly like an inventory ledger. Every beam and board a line item someone else assumed they could cash in. I didn't shout or accuse. That's not who I am. I'm the sort of man who fixes things, measures twice, cuts once. So I went to work. Only this time, the work was different. I pulled the folder Ellen always insisted we keep. Tuition receipts, wedding invoices, the bank transfers I'd made when times were tight. I spread them on the table and read the life we'd paid for, entry by entry. Those small, steady payments had become the scaffold for someone else's comfort. Hearing them call me a burden was like watching a ledger write over my life. Anger came, yes, but it cooled into something quieter and sharper. A plan. First, I asked the lawyer about the deed. Todd read it like a scripture. My name, clear and legal. No one could sell the house without my signature. Guardianship takes paperwork, doctors, proof. The law gave me a perimeter to work within. The idea followed. If they treated my life as an asset they could liquidate, I would liquidate it on my own terms. I called a realtor who specialized in quick cash closings. He walked through the house with professional appetite and admiration: oak floors, custom cabinets, the beam I'd installed to open the living room. "This will move," he said. 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. Cash buyers, close fast. The speed felt like leverage. If they were planning to monetize me, I would convert that house into options for myself. So I moved with quiet precision. I cleaned until the house shone for a buyer's camera, lined up inspections, secured a storage unit for the things that mattered: Ellen's jewelry, the photo albums, the toolbox with my name on it. I signed paperwork with steady hands. The wire hit the account and the number on the screen was more than money. It was choice, an apartment with sunlight, a bank that treated me with respect, the freedom to pick care on my terms if I needed it. I didn't want spectacle. I wanted agency. When they returned from their trip expecting a manageable old man, the locks refused their keys. An envelope, my handwriting across the front, was taped to the door. The note explained plainly that the house had been sold, the proceeds secured, and their belongings in storage for 30 days. I'd even set a small camera by the entry, practical proof for the record, and watched them read the lines that unmade their plan. Caitlin crumpled to the floor. Jeremy raged and blamed, but accusation couldn't alter the signatures they hadn't asked me to provide. I poured a glass of Ellen's favorite wine and sat with her photograph. It wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was a boundary finally drawn. I had been generous for years. Generosity without limits had nearly erased me. Selling the house was the act that reminded everyone, including myself, that my life wasn't a commodity to be negotiated over conference calls. In the weeks after, neighbors talked, some in sympathy, others in quiet judgment. Caitlin left messages, apologies, stitched with demands. Jeremy sent threatening texts that read big until you saw how small the men behind them were. I read them once and deleted them. What mattered now was simpler. I had reclaimed the right to decide my future. That choice, more than any sum in a bank, felt like the truest kind of freedom. They tore the envelope open like people grabbing a life preserver fast, desperate fingers ripping paper as if speed could change ink that had already dried. I watched the feed on my phone from the tiny charger camera I'd tucked into the hallway outlet. The timestamp blinked. Friday, 5:43 p.m. I hadn't put the camera there to gloat. I put it there because evidence is louder than gossip. Caitlin read the note first. Jeremy read over her shoulder. Their faces went through the sequence I'd pictured 100 times. Confusion, then disbelief, then panic blooming into anger. They argued in my living room like people who'd been unmoored and were trying to lash themselves to anything. It was ugly and painfully human entitlement colliding with an outcome they hadn't priced into their plan. I sat in my small apartment with Ellen's photograph across from me and called Todd. Todd is the sort of lawyer who makes a messy problem look like a list you can tick off. His calm steadies you. "They filed?" he asked. When I told him, He didn't sound surprised. Emergency guardianship is what panicked families file to buy time. It's theatrical, but not necessarily persuasive. We need paper, notarized sale documents, bank confirmations, a doctor's note, and your camera footage. Keep everything intact. We'll file an opposition and get a hearing. So I did what a man who'd spent his life building things knows how to do. I organized. I scanned the closing papers, saved the escrow confirmations, backed up the camera footage in multiple places, and emailed Todd's secure links. I got a letter from my physician, a short note confirming I was oriented and capable of financial decisions. It felt odd to have your mental fitness boxed in ink, but in court, ink carries weight. They tried to make noise in other ways. A local forum carried concerned comments. Friends of Caitlin called neighbors. Whisper campaigns are the soft artillery of family fights. But neighbors matter, Mrs. Delgado, who waters the block's gardens, posted that she'd seen me balancing accounts and fixing my porch light last week. A young contractor who'd come by for a job volunteered he'd discussed repair schedules with me. Not explosive evidence, but small testimonies that build a pattern. Opposing counsel served papers that read dramatic and urgent, vulnerable adult, diminished capacity. They attached a clinic note that smelled of haste. Todd called it a fishing expedition, a panic-driven attempt to create a paper trail. He responded with the Fortress of Records escrow statements, the buyer's deposit confirmation, Brian the realtor's inspection notes, and the unedited time-stamped clip from my camera, showing them trying the locks and reading the envelope. The hearing was modest, a courtroom that smelled of coffee and files. Opposing counsel did his best to narrate crisis. Todd presented the documents like a machinist laying out calibrated tools. The judge asked direct questions about capacity and voluntariness. I answered plainly, how I met the realtor, how the sale was structured, the notary at closing. I did not perform outrage. I spoke with the steadiness of someone who had measured twice and cut once. The judge denied the emergency guardianship. Not a triumphant fanfare, just a careful decision. The petition didn't meet the high standard needed for emergency intervention. She left room for orderly review but allowed the sale to stand. Relief was immediate and practical. The wire wasn't reversed, the buyers remained protected, and the legal brakes the other side tried to yank were released, at least for now. Afterwards, I felt the odd mix of exhaustion and a lightness I hadn't expected. Paperwork had saved me more than any shouted confrontation could have. Quiet preparation, doctor's note, escrow confirmations, backups of footage had translated pain into proof. Todd warned me the fight might continue. Families sometimes keep trying in court because the cost of litigation buys them time. I accepted that. I also accepted that I could live with the outcome, money in an account, a small apartment with sunlight, and choices that belonged to me. Caitlin called. She cried. We spoke in halting pieces about fear and selfishness and the way people plan for comfort at the expense of another's dignity. She offered to help. I told her the truth. Planning someone's life without them is a theft, even if you call it concern. She came by later, and the conversation was raw and awkward, no instant forgiveness, but a door opened. That mattered more than any headline. Neighbors noticed the shift. Some gossiped, some offered help. The camera footage I'd stored quietly in a folder ended up being less about humiliation and more about setting the record straight. The buyer closed in good faith. The title company wouldn't reverse without clear legal grounds, and Todd had already made that case. The legal thundercloud had passed because the work had been done before the storm hit. There's a small lesson in all this that surprised me. The most effective kind of resistance to being erased is often the least dramatic. It's not fireworks. It's files. It's a doctor's note, a notarized signature, a timestamp video, a neighbor's short statement. When you transform hurt into documentation, you remove the power of rumor and replace it with facts that courts and careful people respect. That night I brewed coffee at my little kitchen table, Ellen's photograph in the chair opposite like a witness. I felt neither triumph nor malice, just a steady restoration of agency. I'd turned a whispered plan to discard me into a set of choices I controlled. The case was not over, and perhaps it never fully would be. But the sale stood, and for the first time in a long while, I slept without feeling like someone else was signing my life away. After the judge's decision, days narrowed to practical tasks: bank calls, storage, boxes to label. The apartment was modest, a single room with a window facing a maple, and sunlight made plain things feel possible. I learned the coffee shop's rhythm and the barista's name. Routine crept in and softened edges. Caitlin visited. Her early attempts were clumsy casseroles, apologies that sounded rehearsed. She handed me forms. I refused. I asked for presents instead. She cried and tried to explain the fear behind the plan. Our conversations were awkward, not healing, but they grew steadier. Presents became a small language. Neighbors surprised me. Mrs. Delgado left jam. A contractor fixed a step free. These gestures warmed the days. Gossip rippled in forums, yet enough people remembered the man who fixed fences without charge. Reputation quietly steered opinions and sometimes steadied a judge's view. The buyers moved in and left a note praising the oak floors and the beam I'd installed. Knowing someone cared for the house's bones felt healing. The oak would be walked on, the windows would hold new laughter. The work I'd done would live on. Jeremy called once, voice mixed with anger and regret. He asked about fees and fallout. I counseled him. Find work, get help, show up. I did not gloat. I sought dignity, not revenge. Consequences are the natural arithmetic of choices. Money solved practical gaps. I opened the account Todd recommended, paid for storage for Ellen's things, and set up a small trust to shield some funds. Security felt like self-respect. I booked a modest apartment with sunlight and a bench outside where I could read. Arranging life was an act of reclamation. Free time came back in small waves. I walked the park at dawn, drank coffee in the shop, called old friends. I took small projects, fixed a chair, learned to prune roses, cooked Ellen's soups. These tasks rebuilt me more surely than dramatic gestures could. They were honest stitches in a life I was reassembling. Caitlin and I established new boundaries. She visited without schedules and sat in silence beside me. Those silences were not empty. They were scaffolding. She helped retrieve some items from storage photo albums, a teapot, and we talked, haltingly, about rebuilding trust. At night I sat with Ellen's photograph in her cookbook, fingers on notes in the margins. I thought of Saturdays we spent building the house, of the promise in each nail. I felt no triumph in their embarrassment. Instead, I felt calm that comes from reclaiming choice. Paperwork, patience, and presence had restored what mattered most: the right to decide my life. That right, once taken back, meant more than any house or angry call. Now I wake to choices that belong to me: which book to take, whether to walk in the park or sit with a neighbor, a phone call or silence. Each decision tastes like freedom. It proves I still belong to myself. They left the house with new owners' palms on the banister where mine had once been calused. Watching the movers carry boxes out felt like a slow-motion surrender of a life I had built. Except it wasn't surrender. Not by the time I'd signed those papers. It was a handover with terms I had written. The buyers admired the details: the oak floors, the beam I'd installed to open the living room, the custom-fit cabinets. They spoke with the kind of light, practical appreciation that felt like respect. Maybe that's what I wanted most: acknowledgement that something had been done well. After closing, there was a small legal flurry: final confirmations, the title company's polite emails, the bank's helpful staff guiding me through opening a private account. I set a few boundaries first: a trust to protect some funds, a storage unit for Ellen's things, and a modest monthly budget so I wouldn't feel the old uncertainty at night. The money didn't silence the ache, but it gave me options I had long deferred. A doctor I actually liked, a small travel plan for a place Ellen and I had talked about, the ability to fix the porch light in Mrs. Patterson's house when she asked. Decisions that had once required the permission of my own exhaustion were suddenly mine again. The first morning in the new apartment was strange. The curtains were not the heavy curtains I'd put up with Ellen. Instead, light came in clean, unobstructed. I made coffee with the same deliberate patience I used when cement was setting. The small rituals mattered suddenly, the way the mug warmed my palms, the steam lifting the scent of beans into the room. It was ordinary, and it was revolutionary. I walked to the park and watched people move in their ordinary patterns. A man walking his dog. A woman jogging with earbuds. Freedom revealed itself in these small, unnoticed movements. Caitlin came by in the weeks after the sale. Her visits were awkward, stitched with apologies and long silences. She brought casseroles the first time, then showed up with quiet offers of help retrieving things from storage. I refused the first casseroles because I wanted a different kind of currency, presence. She learned to sit without filling the space with words. We both learned to let silence do some of the work. It was uncomfortable and necessary. There's no quick undo for years of taking. Repair is slow and often boring: papers to sign, boxes to open, a cup of coffee shared without a ledger in mind. Neighbors, surprisingly, were a steady chorus. Some said nothing. Some watched with discreet curiosity. Mrs. Delgado left a mason jar of peaches on my doorstep and a note that said simply, "You deserve peace." Mrs. Patterson offered to show me how to use the community garden. Those small acts of ordinary kindness stitched a new fabric around me. Reputation is fragile, but it's not only defense, it can be repair too. Legal skirmishes cooled into bureaucratic papers. Jeremy's bluster quieted as he faced the reality of finding work and paying moving expenses. He made calls to accountants and tried to fix the mess his choices had created. He came by once, hat in hand, asking for advice about an unpaid contractor. I gave him a straight answer: get to work, keep your word, start small. He left angrier than before, but less entitled. Sometimes, the humbling of consequence does what lectures cannot. There were quieter pleasures too. I found myself fixing small things for neighbors, not out of obligation, but because I liked the work. I built a bench for the community garden, sanded planks slowly until the wood glowed. A child from down the block came by, watched me work, and asked questions about how to hold a hammer. I remembered teaching my daughter to hold it that same way, guiding the pressure until it was steady. The sight of that kid learning warmed something that legal victories never could. A small, public ripple surprised me. A column in the local paper that framed the story not as scandal, but as a question of dignity. It quoted neighbors, a lawyer's cautious commentary, and in the margins, the community's curiosity. The story wasn't a triumphalist banner. It was a reflection. How do we care for aging parents without erasing them? The piece opened conversations at church gatherings and over neighborhood fences. People began to ask better questions. What safeguards prevent exploitation? How do families communicate about care and money without assuming consent? One evening, while sorting through a box from storage, I found an old note Ellen had tucked into a drawer, an unfinished recipe with a margin in her careful script. Don't give away your power. Roy. Her handwriting had always been steady. Seeing it was like a hand on my shoulder. It reminded me that the battle was never just about houses or bank accounts. It was about the right to shape the last chapters of your life. The relationship with Caitlin didn't mend overnight. Trust, once stretched and frayed, takes repetitive honesty to repair. We began small, phone calls, then shared dinners, then longer conversations where she described fears about aging she had never voiced before. She began to see how her plans had been more about fear than malice. That didn't excuse the betrayal, but it opened a route to something like understanding. Yet even as I built these new habits, there was a quiet undercurrent I could not ignore. The way the world treats aging people, especially those whose kindness has been monetized into someone else's lifestyle. I began volunteering at a community center once a week, helping older neighbors organize their paperwork, teaching them simple steps to protect themselves, how to keep receipts, how to demand copies, when to call a lawyer. The work felt purposeful, a way to turn my own wound into a tool for others. I kept the camera tucked away in a drawer, the footage archived, because evidence is sometimes necessary but never raison d'etre. The true victory felt different. A life repositioned by decisions I made rather than those made for me. The wire in the account had bought me options, yes. But more than that, it bought me the ability to answer the next knock on the door with a steady voice and a clear boundary. As spring pushed into summer, I sat on a bench in the community garden and watched a neighbor teach a boy to plant tomatoes. The small hands dug earth and backfilled, the same way I'd once taught my daughter to pack soil around a seed. It felt like continuation, not loss. I had not won because my family faltered. I had won because I would not let them decide my fate for me. That line between being cared for and being consumed was delicate. I had drawn it, and now I lived on the side I had chosen. They kept trying, in small ways and blunt ones, emails from lawyers, a terse voicemail that sounded like a threat, a neighbor tapping my door to say that Caitlin had been in tears all week. But the worst of the noise had faded into paperwork and appointments. Life, for the first time in years, felt less like a ledger and more like a sequence of moments I could choose to fill. One morning I woke before dawn and went to the park with a thermos of coffee. The sky was a thin sheet of blue, and an old woman was walking her terrier, bundled against the last of the spring chill. I sat on a bench and listened to the city start up. A bus sighing, the paperboy calling, someone in the distance setting up a lawnmower. It was ordinary, and that ordinariness felt like grace. I had expected triumph to taste sweeter. Instead, it was quiet. The pleasure was in small freedoms, deciding which bread to buy, when to call my sister, whether to spend an afternoon painting a bench I'd promised at the community garden. Caitlin's apologies came in rhythms, stunned silence, frantic messages, one carefully worded letter that read more like a brief than a confession. Then she showed up at the apartment without warning. She stood in the doorway holding a thermos of soup and a bag of groceries, a ridiculous, vulnerable thing for a woman who'd been so busy engineering her exit strategy. She asked if she could stay for a while. She did not bring lawyers. She brought the awkwardness of someone who had learned to manage on spreadsheets, not on mercy. We talked, haltingly at first, about banal things. The rain, her work travel, the neighbor who'd fixed his fence wrong. Then the conversation took its inevitable turn to what happened, why it happened, and whether it could be fixed. She said the words I'd heard on that fateful call had been more about fear than cruelty, that Jeremy had amplified anxieties until they sounded like plans. She asked, in a voice that was almost a whisper, for a chance to be part of my life again. I listened longer than I spoke. There is a strange humility in waiting, in letting someone try to step back into a place they once took for granted. She offered to retrieve boxes from storage. I said yes, because sometimes small practical acts are a way to start mending a fabric that had been pulled too tight. We drove to the unit together and watched as she opened crate after crate of photographs, of holiday ornaments, of the teapot Ellen favored. The objects did not erase what had happened, but they gave us things to do that didn't require new promises, just small, concrete steps. Meanwhile, the legal edges continued to tick. A settlement offer arrived from their side, not a public spectacle, just a bland envelope with numbers and conditions. It proposed a partial return of funds under conditions I found insulting, admissions, waivers, language that erased the agency I'd fought to reclaim. I folded the paper and set it aside. The point of selling had never been to make them suffer. It had been to stop being subsumed into someone else's plan. If settlement equaled humiliation, I would refuse it. If it offered genuine reconciliation, access to the albums, help with some repairs, a promise of care, then maybe it would be useful. For now, I chose boundaries over bargains. I used some of the money to do practical things, pay off recurring debts that had shadowed my life, prepay for a small dental work I'd been postponing, and set up a modest rainy day fund. I did not travel to the places Ellen and I had talked about yet. Instead, I bought a warm winter coat and a new pair of work gloves. Practicalities have a way of restoring dignity. A man with a coat that fits feels sturdier against the cold. I also set aside funds to hire a part-time helper for home maintenance, somebody I trusted because choosing help on my terms felt like self-respect, not surrender. The neighborhood's reaction matured. Initial gossip gave way to a quiet curiosity, and then to gestures I hadn't expected. An invitation to the community barbecue, a neighbor asking my advice about building a shed, a handwritten note from the owner of the tiny antique shop down the street thanking me for restoring and donating an old bench. The bitterness some felt softened when they saw that the house I'd sold was being cared for by people who appreciated its bones. That small approval mattered less than I thought it would. It only mattered insofar as it kept the air around us civil. One afternoon, a local nonprofit reached out and asked if I would speak at a workshop about elder rights, how to keep paperwork, how to recognize undue influence, how to create simple estate safeguards. They wanted someone who had lived the experience, not a lawyer in a suit. I hesitated, then agreed. Standing in front of a modest crowd, caregivers, adult children, a few people who still wore their work boots, I told the truth, without theatrics. Keep receipts, keep copies, ask questions. Don't assume kindness is consent. My voice was steady. The room's attention felt like a small altar. The applause afterwards was quiet and real. Jeremy tried to come back into the orbit with a series of half-answers and then a job search update that read like a resume. He asked for help finding honest local work, and I gave him a list of contacts. There was no reconciliation in handing over a contact sheet. Reconciliation requires accountability and time, but it was a practical bridge. He used the information, and months later I saw him carrying a plasterboard sheet down the block, sweat on his brow. It was not instant redemption, but it was a start. The most surprising part of this section of the story was how ordinary small acts of repair can be. There was no cinematic reconciliation scene, no knockout confession. Instead, there were dozens of tiny acknowledgments. A phone call returned, a neighbor's offer to water plants, a box of biscuits left on my stoop. Those acts piled up into something like a new normal. I kept a few routines from the old life deliberately. Saturday mornings at the coffee shop, a weekly call with Todd, not to obsess but to make sure papers were in order. An hour every Sunday to sort old receipts and label boxes I'd never throw away. Routine holds you up when the drama fades and the quieter, harder work of living begins. There are nights when the quiet crowd's in, and I still miss Ellen with an ache that doesn't fade. Sometimes I take out her cookbook and make a small recipe, tasting the margin notes and remembering the way the kitchen felt when she moved through it. Those memories are private and sacred. They're not a currency for the world to spend on drama. Toward the end of the season, Caitlin invited me to a modest gathering neighbors, a few friends, no pomp. She spoke in front of everyone and said the words people struggle to say in public. She was sorry. It was not an absolution. It was an opening. I listened and then stood, not to give a speech, but to offer a small contribution. I announced a monthly volunteer slot helping older neighbors with paperwork. People nodded, then moved into the room for coffee. The act was small, and yet it felt like the only kind of public closure that matters. The sale had been a painful hinge. The legal fight had been a long grind. But what followed was not revenge so much as reconstruction, rebuilding a life that bore the seams of what had been lost, but was stitched by choices I had finally made. I had not sought to humiliate. I had sought to stop being erased. In the end, boundaries had reshaped relationships, and the quiet work of everyday life began to matter more than the loud moments that had brought me here. The story had not ended. Family is rarely so simple, but a new chapter was taking shape, one where I decided the terms, where presence mattered more than profit, and where dignity finally had a place to stand. The dust had barely settled, and yet the house still seemed to hum with the echo of everything that had happened there. For a long time, I kept expecting the strange mix of relief and loneliness to settle into one shape, something I could name and live with. Instead, it unfolded in small, patient ways. Mornings with coffee that wasn't rushed, afternoons fixing a neighbor's fence, evenings on the bench outside my apartment reading things Ellen used to love. Those quiet routines became a kind of resurrection. People asked if I felt vindicated when they heard the story. The honest answer is complicated. There was a moment, brief and private, when I replayed the image of Caitlin and Jeremy reading that envelope, and I felt a cold satisfaction. But satisfaction isn't the same as joy. It's closer to closure, a line drawn where before there had only been blur. What sustained me afterward was not the memory of their embarrassment, but the accumulation of small, true choices I could finally make for myself. Those choices were ordinary. I booked the dentist appointment I'd postponed for years. I bought a winter coat that fit properly. I paid to have the porch light fixed at Mrs. Patterson's house because she was tired of asking, and I liked how the porch looked with light on it. Practical things rebuild a life in ways grand gestures never can. They restore rhythm and restore the belief that you're more than the sum other people make of you. Caitlin stopped by more often. Our visits were not cinematic reconciliations. They were clumsy and slow, half apologies and half bargaining. She brought casseroles. She helped unload a box from storage. She asked about a photo album and listened while I told stories she had failed to notice before, small domestic histories that had never been filed in her mind, as important because they weren't Instagram ready. In time, the awkwardness softened into something quieter, a presence that was tentative but consistent. She began to ask questions she probably should have asked years ago about my needs and my preferences, and sometimes she actually listened. Jeremy found work. He showed up one afternoon with a tool belt and sweat on his brow, carrying materials for a neighbor's deck. He did not ask for forgiveness. He worked. The first time I saw him steady on a ladder, focused on a task that required attention rather than entitlement, I felt the shape of consequence become useful rather than merely punitive. Consequence does not automatically reform a person, but it can create the conditions for change. He was not the son I had raised in a single afternoon of humility. He was a man taking the long, slow path back toward decency. The neighborhood stitched itself back together in small acts. People brought over soup, fixed a leaking gutter, waved from porches. Mrs. Delgado left jars of peach preserves on my stoop with notes that said, simply, "Thinking of you." Those notes did more to my heart than any courtroom victory. Community is not a verdict, it's a practice. It shows up. It waters the small beginnings. I began volunteering at a local community center once a week, helping older folks organize paperwork and understand how to protect themselves from undue influence. Standing in front of that modest group felt oddly right. I spoke plainly. Keep receipts, ask for copies, insist on being present for conversations about your money. I told a few stories, never naming names, about how easy it is to be worn down by kindness turned habit. People nodded. Some cried. One woman hugged me at the end and said she wished she'd been told this earlier. It was the kind of work that made the sale mean more than money. It made it a lesson to be shared. There were tense moments, of course. Legal threads can unspool unexpectedly. A late invoice, a bureaucratic correction, a terse email from an old lawyer. Those were reminders that life is rarely neat. But the pattern had changed. I responded with documents and appointments, with careful phone calls and calm language. The fight had taught me that the best defense against being erased is to keep records and to keep friends who will testify to your presence. On quiet evenings, I took out Ellen's cookbook and read the margin notes she'd written in her steady hand, the tiny corrections that only someone who cooked daily would think to make. Her handwriting felt like company. I made one of her simple soups and sat with it as if with a ritual. It was small, and it made me whole in ways law could not. Some losses are private, some are legal. Both need tending in their own ways. Toward the end of the summer, Caitlin organized a small neighborhood potluck. She invited people who had been at the edges of the story, neighbors, a few of the people from the community center, the contractor who'd fixed my step. She stood up and said, out loud in front of others, the things that are hard to say in private, that she was sorry, that she had misread love for entitlement, that she regretted how quickly she had counseled removal over conversation. It was not absolution. It was an opening. I stood, and in front of the small, imperfect crowd, I said something simple. We are all learning how to be better family to one another. People clapped politely. It felt enough. The money from the sale funded a modest security, a trust for the things that mattered, and a monthly stipend to manage the life I wanted. I didn't build an empire. I bought a quiet freedom, the ability to hire help when my back ached, to fix the leaky faucet without asking permission, to visit the coast for a weekend and feel the wind push old memories sideways. The funds made things possible. My choices made them meaningful. In the end, the story that mattered most was not about retribution, but about boundaries. I had learned that generosity without limits is not virtue. It can be erasure. I learned that asserting dignity is not cruelty, but survival. I learned that families fracture and sometimes recover in ways that are slow and imperfect. And I learned that a life you choose, even when it requires leaving a house you built with your hands, is still a life worth guarding. Some nights I still wake up with the shape of my old house in my head, a bay window glinting in the dark, the floorboards with their familiar groan. I picture Ellen's face and I smile. I picture my daughter grown into someone who understands, and I hope. But mostly I picture mornings that begin because I chose them. The coffee, the walk to the park, the small tasks that make a day belong to you. That, more than anything else, felt like the true resolution. Not the last word spoken across a table, but the steady right to speak it at all.